So today I want to talk about the fast fashion graveyard in Chile. Fast fashion, like most forms of rampant overproduction and consumerism, is taking its toll on our planet. If you're not familiar with the practice of fast fashion by businesses, it's a model based on producing cheap and fast clothing at low prices to match the current fashion trends. Essentially, businesses will copy the latest high fashion trends and mass produce them using cheap synthetic materials and exploited sweatshop labor. The result is a very cheap and consumable clothing that is sold in stores like H&M, Forever 21, and Zara. This process then gets replicated for each new fashion cycle and every season, creating literal tons of waste for products that are not sold. The products are usually only considered viable for sale during the fashion season in which they're produced. As the season ends, a lot of the products will go on clearance in places like the United States or Europe. And if they're still not sold at that point, they'll often be shipped down to Chile and other parts of Latin America, where if they go unsold there, the clothing eventually ends up in a landfill. So today I want to talk about one of the largest clothing landfills in Chile, which is known as a fast fashion graveyard, where old fashion literally goes to die. Now, we have an article here from Business Insider. A mountain of unsold clothing from fast fashion retailers is piling up in the Chilean desert. So we have on screen an image where a woman is actually searching through a pile of clothing, a literal mountain of clothing and garments that are discarded in the Atacama desert. And the clothing looks to be at least 3 times her height in terms of how high it's piled up. Now, in top of all of this, with all of this in mind, you have these heaps of unworn clothes which are being discarded in the Chilean desert, which is adding to a swiftly swelling graveyard of fast fashion lines past. So all of these former fashions that I mentioned, when they become out of style, this is where they're essentially ending up, in these large piles like the one I showed on screen. Now, an organization has actually determined that about 59,000 tons of clothing actually end up in the port of Chile every single year. And of that, about 39,000 are moved into the landfill in the desert. Now, we have another image on the screen, and I just want to put this in context. In the top right corner, where presumably there's like a little road or dirt pathway, there's a car there. And you can see the size of this land of just pure discarded garments in comparison to the size of that car. And this aerial view really does a great job to show exactly how much trash there really here is in the Atacama Desert. All of this really does to me show a sign that there's a massive issue of overproduction, and we really do need to start looking at models of degrowth and moving in the direction of starting to end how much we produce and change how we produce on a global scale. Because the fact of the matter is, this is so much waste. And there's already a lot of issues in terms of fashion around waste, where a lot of people, especially in the trendsetter mindset, will only wear certain fashions once or twice. And that's producing waste as it is. But this is clothing that is more than likely never even being worn or used, and we're still producing it in mass and blowing out 39,000 tons of useless fabric every single year because there's no way to consume and use it. And that's a disturbing trend of just pure waste material and what's going into that. Just from that standpoint, this is a problem. But this is made even worse by the fact that most of these clothing pieces, these garments, are not actually biodegradable, as most of them are made with synthetic materials and chemical products. And so it can't actually be degraded in these landfills. Now, there is a person here that's mentioned, Franklin Zapata, founder of Ecofibra, a company that's trying to make use of discarded clothing by making insulation panels out of it. And I'm all in favor of anybody who's able to take these waste products and actually make something good with them and actually make it accessible for some sort of product to be produced. However, whenever I see these type of products that are using old recycled plastics or seeing all of these non-biodegradable materials being turned into things like insulation, I start to get worried about the amount of microplastics that are going to be inhaled by people in the region. Now, there is an argument to be made that it's already causing damage damage. It's already in a landfill, so it might as well be used. And I agree with that. And I'm not speaking in any way negative about that. My point in bringing that up, though, is that this is still going to potentially have harmful effects on people, even if it is produced and reused in a way that is beneficial to people. And I'd rather do that, but at the end of the day, it's still causing harm. Now, for one, the fast fashion industry actually accounts for 8 to 10% of the world's carbon emissions. That's an absurd amount. And that's again according to UN data. In 2018, the fashion industry was also found to consume more energy than the aviation and shipping industries combined. And researchers estimate that the equivalent of a garbage truck of clothes is burned and sent to landfills every single second. And that's just the amount of waste, the amount of chemicals that are being burned, the amount of runoff that's going to come off of all of that clothing, the amount of microplastics that are going to end up in the air that is going to be breathed in by people. It's absurd how much of this is going to end up in people's bodies, in water supplies, and just cause extensive amounts of harm. And it's not even for something we're using, it's just creating profit for a bunch of companies to make their money off of an industry that's not really producing anything viable or useful. Now, when we look more into the details of what exactly the impacts of fast fashion are on the environment, we find this article produced through Princeton, and we get that excessive water usage is actually one of the biggest issues when it comes to this production. So not only are we wasting the fabric, but we need to think about how much of that fabric relies on and is created through labor and through the materials that we have to grow out of the ground. If a product is 35%, say, polyester, it could still have a significant portion of it that's made with, say, cotton. And it actually takes about 10,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of cotton, or approximately 3,000 liters of water for one cotton shirt. And that's a lot of water to just be throwing into a landfill in a world where water is starting to become scarce in certain regions. We see that in the US West that there's massive drought issues. There's other parts of the world that are experiencing huge issues where they cannot produce enough water, and we're just wasting 3,000 liters of it in one go for a shirt that's just going to end up in a landfill. That's not even counting shipping it to the United States from a lot of the areas that it's being produced, and then shipping it from there to Chile and the costs that are involved in all of that. Now, furthermore, textiles dyeing requires toxic chemicals to be spilled into the oceans. Actually, approximately 20% of wastewater worldwide is attributed to this process, which accumulates over time. And as many factories are moved overseas, a lot of countries that these organizations and businesses buy into, which do not have as strict of environmental regulations, will end up spilling more and more into the oceans. And the fact of the matter is they do this specifically because they know that as long as they don't have to pay for the externality of the damage that they do to the water supplies and the oceans, they can get away with it and make more money. And the problem in all of this is just how affordable and cheap it's made for these companies to constantly poison people and water supplies. And now, regrettably, the wastewater created is also extremely toxic and in many cases cannot be treated safely. This is an image on screen right now from Greenpeace of image of dyes that have been dumped into the ocean waters. And you literally have this reddish purple hue of water mixed with the natural blues of the water and some kind of unnatural shades of blue as well. Now, in addition, I did mention this before, but plastic microfibers are a significant issue. Synthetic materials are the primary culprits that cause microfibers to enter our oceans. To be exact, approximately 35% of all microplastics are from these synthetic materials. And as we're discovering more and more about the issues of microfibers and plastics, we're finding that more and more of that is ending up in human bodies. People are breathing it in. It's ending up in our food supplies and our water supplies, and it's not uncommon for people to find that there's a significant amount of microfibers and plastics in our bodies. And it's not only just us, it's having toxic impacts on marine ecosystems. It's just causing a huge issue throughout the human food chain as well. And this is what we're dealing with when we're talking about that 39,000 tons that's coming from these fast fashion productions and then ending up in the Chilean desert. Now, excessive consumption of clothing is another major factor here, like I talked about. And when we end up with all that waste product, there's two ways to deal with it. You either throw it in a landfill or you burn it. And literally burning something that you've produced that has taken all of the time of humans laboring to grow the cotton out of the ground, to pick the cotton, to then put it into and weave it into clothing using machines that were produced by another set of hands, only to have it then shipped across the world to be burned. It has to be one of the most infuriating processes and ideas that this makes money for people. This isn't even the creation of something valuable or good, it's just waste. And that's not even counting the amount that is cut around a lot of the cloth that has to also be additionally discarded. Because if you think about it, you're not going to get a full cut out of most sheets of fabric. If you have a yard of fabric, for example, and you cut the material for a shirt out of it, there's a good chance that the ends, the cutting pieces, the little tears that you have are going to end up in landfills as well. And that's not necessarily all being accounted for in all of this. But when you have all of this burned or in landfills, again, a lot of the landfills will cause it so that the soil and the ground nearby, and also a lot of the runoff from rain causing it to fall into water supplies, will lead to a lot of these synthetic chemicals and the microplastics ending up in water and food supplies. In addition to that, when it's burned, what do you think happens to that? Well, it ends up in the air, and people in communities nearby end up breathing in the toxic and poisonous gases that are in these landfills. And it ends up causing long-term harms to humans, and likely probably a significant amount of cancer is going to be caused by a lot of these burning processes. Again, for someone to make profit off of essentially creating waste product. Now, the other thing worth mentioning is one particular material, viscose or rayon, however you want to pronounce it, is one of the most harmful chemicals that is found in clothing. The carbon disulfide that is produced as part of the production process is lethal and has really harmful negative side effects to the workers as well that produce the materials, and it's one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And this is the thing. You have these large companies copying these fashion trends and then essentially putting cheap labor, sweatshop labor, in the conditions where they'll be harmed by this and will likely get sick and die eventually from this in order to produce a waste product, and this somehow generates wealth and money for these companies. And it harms the planet as well. There's no upside to all of this. So it's worth noting when I talk about all this, though, that this problem is very much systemic. And it's not something that any single individual can simply fix. Changing our buying habits or relying on, quote, voting with our dollars, as is often touted to us as a cure under capitalism, isn't going to fix all this. And not buying fast fashion trends, especially for people who are struggling financially, is not only not affordable for a lot of people, but it's also just not actively attainable, especially with a lot of the ways in which we interact with clothes in our lives. People need to have a certain set of clothing. They need to have a certain amount of clothing, and we're very much reliant on that within the way that we view and look at things on a social level as well. So it's not just going to fix itself by buying differently or anything of that sort. But the real issue to me is something that I've been kind of hinting at with all of this. It's the fact that this current model is considered profitable under our current economic systems, and that the production is so cheap due to the use of these cheap, harmful chemicals and the exploitation of cheap labor, which should be, actually getting money for what it's producing. If we're going to have all this production, they should at least be being paid and giving living wages, and in many cases, they're not. And this all becomes cheap and valuable for these companies who can maintain, again, this level of production that isn't working simply because of fashion trends, simply because of the exploitation of labor and the cheap cost of these chemicals, and the fact that they never have to pay for or deal with the externalities and additional costs that are produced by what they make. They're not the ones storing the landfills. They're not the ones breathing in the chemicals. They're not the ones having to deal with the waste product at the end. They only end up making the money off of the production. And from all of this overproduction and waste, it's profitable, so it keeps occurring. And I think we really do need to rethink our models and start to move towards degrowth and alternate ways of production. Because otherwise, we're never going to be able to reduce how much we produce, and we're never going to be able to fix this ill that we have of so much waste. And honestly, the main culprit in all of this is capitalism, because capitalism incentivizes all of this, and it'll keep doing this. We cannot fix or reform this system. We need to come up with something else, and degrowth is not in any way compatible with capitalism. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord, as well as subscribe to me on Patreon. All of those links are in the description down below. That said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.